Welcome, everyone, to this virtual seminar organized by the International Society for the Study of Early Medieval England. My name is Thijs Bork. I'm the current president of the Society, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to this seminar, which is co-organized with the Japan Society for Medieval English Studies. Before I hand over the floor to the president of that society, let me remind you that we are organizing these virtual seminars to showcase all of the exciting research that's going on within our field, ranging from historical linguistics to archaeology to literary studies, philology, and eco-criticism. And this year, we've been very lucky to collaborate with various societies and research projects within our field. And today, we're very honored to be collaborating with the Japan Society for Medieval English Studies, which this year celebrates its 40th anniversary. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce the president of the Japan Society for Medieval English Studies, Professor Hironori Suzuki, who will introduce the society as well as today's speaker. Professor Suzuki, the floor is yours.
I'm Hironori Suzuki of Daito Bunkai University in Tokyo, and I currently serve as president of JSMES, the Japan Society for Medieval English Studies. Now, it is my great privilege to introduce both our society, JSMES, and the speaker, Associate Professor Britton Brooks of Kyushu University. First, as for JSMES, it was founded in 1984 for those interested in medieval English language, literature, culture, religion, and society in the British Isles between the years circa 450 and 1500 CE. JSMES currently has over 250 active members from all over Japan, ranging from a graduate student to the most established scholars in the field. The JSMES work currently includes holding our annual National Congress each December and 2 branch conferences, publishing our academic journal ISSEME and newsletters, and maintaining the JSMES listserv and the website for members. This year, JSMES will be holding our 40th anniversary National Congress, so participating in the ISSEME virtual seminars today will definitely enhance our 40th anniversary events. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Brooks of Kyushu University. He obtained a DPhil, PhD in Medieval English Literature at the University of Oxford. His research centers on early medieval English literature and the environmental humanities, with increasing interest in the blue humanities. His publication includes his 2019 monograph, Restoring Creation, the Natural World in the Anglo-Saxon Saints' Lives of Cuthbert and Guthrag. The edited collection, Global Perspectives on Early Medieval England, as well as a number of articles, including several stemming from his recently completed JSPS Grand Project, Early Medieval Soundscapes. These include The Sound World of Early Medieval England, a case study of the Exeter book Stone Riddle, a book chapter in Ideas of the World in Early Medieval England, and published just a few months ago, Sonic Journeys on the Open Sea, Testing the Faithful in Old English and Anglo-Latin Literature, in the journal The Review of English Studies. This talk today represents the beginning of his next JSPS Grand Project, Knowing Oceans, the Early Medieval English North Sea. The title of his talk is Knowing Oceans, Early Medieval Seas. Now, it is my great pleasure to hand the virtual floor over to Professor Brooks.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Suzuki, for your kind introduction, and thank you, Thijs, and all of you for allowing us to be here. We're very excited to join this virtual seminar. All right. Just to say, as Professor Suzuki mentioned, this is, oh, there we go. This research stems from kind of the end of my last project and the beginning of my current one. And for the JSMES members, the beginning of this talk, it draws some research some of you may have heard, but there's a lot of new stuff. So essentially do stick around, especially for the second half of the talk. All right, so the early medieval world of the British and Irish archipelago was, in many ways, an aqueous one, where seas, oceans, lakes, and rivers provided crucial avenues for the movements of people, goods, and ideas. They also provided resources, for example, salmon and eels to eat, as well as raw materials like whelks and dye and seaweed for fertilizer. With the increasingly vibrant scholarship of the environmental humanities and the blue humanities in particular, the role of these waters has gained essentially more critical attention. Yet much of this work is predominantly anthropocentric and most often archaeological and historical. There's a slight scholarly gap in researching literary responses to the medieval seas, particularly in connection with recent advances in fields like environmental history and historical climatology, and specifically ones that shift the critical gaze to the ocean, its wild material self. Tonight, let's try something. Let's center the ocean, face the sea, and wade into its waters. And yes, there will be terrible puns like that throughout. At its heart, sorry, stop. No, sorry, it's not stopping. There we go. Okay. At its heart, this paper tonight holds a very simple premise, that the bodies of water in which the human world essentially floats matter in their totality, not merely as ideals, exegetical fodder, biblical echo, poetic scene, but also in their specific, local, and fluid materiality. I'm drawing here, albeit very loosely, I'll admit, from the basic tenets of new materialism and material ecocritical theory, helpfully summarized here by Serpil Opperman, that material ecocriticism turns to the shaping influence of material agencies, in particular material contexts, which appear in many forms, the ozone hole, rocks, flowers, plastic bags. And it's through the intermingling agencies and signifying forces of cohesion and discord that we come to know the world, because they precipitate meaningful situations by shaping and affecting the way human beings relate to the world. This position recognizes essentially the agentic nature of matter, that it both acts and is acted upon. With regards to the paper tonight, I aim to highlight how it is the specific material qualities of the oceans, the seas, the inorganic and organic matter which constitute those environments, that allows them to act upon early medieval English peoples, transforming, shaping their literary productions. So enough preamble, enough putting on sunblock and wetsuits. It's time to submerge. Now, let's start with the question. This is an actual non-rhetorical question. Who among you loves the sea? Anybody like the ocean? See, got some hands raised. Excellent. All right. Now, for most of us, myself included, what we really mean by this is we love the shore. We love the shallows. Beaches we swim, surf, dive, never really that far from land. This holds true of the majority of early medieval English peoples as well. River travel, journeys along the coast would have been fairly common, while crossings over the North Sea or the English Channel would have been reserved for a relatively select few. So it's here we begin our journey, where land meets sea. Yet, the sea, as the seaweed poet and writer Meek Zwamborn notes, quote, "The sea begins somewhere else each day." And while all shores exist as areas in perpetual flux, the moon's mass daily pulling the earth and drawing water out and then back again, the British and Irish archipelago are remarkably distinct. Due to their geological features and planetary position, these islands have some of the largest tidal variations in the world. And it's kind of up in the right-hand corner. Sorry, probably covered by people's videos. There are numerous sites around the planet with macro tidal variation. That's where tidal ranges are more than 4 meters. But most of these places are small parts of a coastline. You know, a bay here, a few headlands there. Oh yeah, well, the red circle is highlighted. I'll go to the next slide. There you go. Whereas for Britain and Ireland, they are encircled by macro tidal shifting of the seas and oceans. And as archaeological, literary, and historical evidence demonstrates, from the large number of settlements along the coast to the importance of aqueous travel, a relatively large proportion of early medieval peoples would have been in regular contact with the tides, their influences, and their regular rhythms. And the great shifting of waters was an ever-present feature of life along its coast, influencing daily behavior, including when boats could enter harbors, when people would forage for shellfish, and even upstream, where and when to set eel and salmon traps, and when to harvest them. The movement of the seas and oceans moved people. This evening, I would like to explore two specific ways the material qualities of the intertidal world affected early medieval English peoples. First, the poetically rich and often commented upon fluidity, liminality of where land meets sea. Oh, sorry, get back. And as Catherine Clark and others have noted, there was, and I would argue still is, a preoccupation with this intertidal world and relatively shallow, essentially, other worlds. For example, Clark highlights in lines 282 to 91 of the Old English poem Exodus, via speech by Moses, of the Israelites crossing the dry land of the Red Sea. Now, the imagery here, as both J.R. Hall and Clark note, has no direct scriptural source, but develops the biblical passage from Exodus. As Clark says, quote, "The focus of fascination here is the marvelous nature of the land uncovered by the sea, and the idea of walking in a space which is usually hidden beneath deep water." But why should that be the case? This consistent fascination with and connection to worlds sort of beyond our own that get revealed here. I would like to argue that, again, it is the daily material obscuring and revealing of the tides, as well as the constantly shifting physical opacity of seawater itself that acted upon early medieval English peoples to both deny and allow access to specific locations, whether some nebulous otherworld, a sacred space in the mundane world, or simply a location to gather resources. Now, while numerous scholars have noted the ways in which tides separate and create sacred locations, like Lindisfarne, which, as Bede notes in his various lives of St. Cuthbert, is a tidal island, and therefore functions both as a site both of and not of this world, there's been less discussion of the actual tidal spaces themselves, and importantly for us here, how such revelations function by way of the materiality of the sea, the tides and transparency of seawater. In her excellent PhD thesis, Sarah Corrigan examines images and representations of the sea in both Hiberno-Latin and vernacular literature, and at one point discusses the tradition of Saint Clement, specifically with regards to a single ocean miracle. Due to the usual conflicts of such things, the Roman Emperor Trajan has ordered Clement to be executed, but by being drowned in the sea. The emperor is attempting, in this watery martyrdom, to stop the creation of a sacred site, of a location in which the intercession of the martyred saint could be experienced, drawing the power of heaven to earth. An early version of this narrative comes from the 5th to 6th century Passio Sancti Clementis, which I have a bit on the screen here. Let him be brought into the middle of the sea, an anchor tied to his neck, and let him be thrown down so that the Christians will not be able to worship him. Importantly, however, God, the only entity powerful enough to command the tides, of course, produces a miracle. Then when the people are praying, the sea recedes by almost 3 miles, and walking across dry land, the crowds found a structure prepared by God in the form of a marble shrine, and there in the box is the Holy Clement, and the anchor that was thrown with him is placed next to him as well. As Corrigan also highlights, this miracle of revealing the divinely constructed shrine happens every year on the day of St. Clement's death, when the sea pulls back for 7 days to allow access to the saint's relics. Now, there are several things that are relevant to us tonight. The first, which is from a bit earlier in the text, is the location of the saint's martyrdom, the Black Sea, up here referred to as the Ponticum Mare. Now, while the specific location, of course, is relatively uncertain, the interesting thing is the Black Sea itself, where tidal variations are extremely minimal, ranging from 0.1 centimeter at most to at most in one specific location, 18 to 19 centimeters. This is a far cry, of course, from the British 4 meters. The specific distance, then, of the sea's retreat, the 3 miles, becomes truly miraculous. This is a narrative in which the lack of tidal actions usually creates a greater miracle, in that the now dry seabed is a world never seen, except through the mingling of sunlight and water's transparency. The water, by the power of God, pulled back, echoing as all these miracles do, of course, the Red Sea parting in the book of Exodus, and revealed a dry, sacred place, a divinely constructed pilgrimage location where Clement's relics may be encountered. Now, the miracle, of course, like most saints' relics related to miracles, centers on providing a locus for pilgrimage to the saints' remains. Now, this story miracle was told a number of times with some variation. In Gregor of Tours' 6th century Liber in Gloria Martyrum, which includes a distance of 3 miles but does not mention the submarine shrine, as well as insular versions like Bede's early 8th century Martyrology, and then the early 9th century Old Irish Martyrology of Oengus. In the Irish tradition, the tale of St. Clement is transformed from one focusing on the miraculous revealing of the shrine via tidal action into one that utilizes the material transparency of the water to allow visual engagement with this essential otherworld. Now, the Old Irish Martyrology of Oengus is the oldest extant Irish vernacular metrical martyrology and gives us the following. I'm not going to try and pronounce the Irish because it would be very bad. So I'll just do the English. The fair suffering of Clement among the sea's waves, his convent adored under the waves of the wide main. This quatrain is all that is given concerning Clement's martyrdom and miracle. But note, there is no description of the sea pulling back to reveal the shrine. Instead, it is depicting as simply residing under the waves of the wide main. And as Corrigan and others highlight, the specific term here, which is translated as convent, gestures to a much larger series of structures than the simple shrine of the Passio. She also highlights how the notion of submarine religious communities has a number of analogues in later Middle Irish and Hiberno-Latin sources, including a narrative in the Liber Hymnorum that describes a submerged chapel off the Sea of Wight, in which a blind boy spends a year beneath the waves, eventually bringing back the specific office for singing the hours for the Order of St. Bridget. It's a great story. You really should read this. It's excellent. What Corrigan doesn't spend a lot of time on, and what I would like to highlight today, is that each of these Irish submerged stories function via the transparent nature of water, that the way it can separate worlds, but allow via the power of vision engagement with these undersea locations. The miracle in the martyrology of Oengus has been transformed from allowing physical access to the saints' relics into this kind of spiritual vision of this holy location. The motif of the tidal miracle, whose potency in the early medieval world of the British archipelago was largely based essentially on the daily experiences of the tides, continued to be utilized in the post-conquest period. So Simeon of Durham, for example, in his early 12th century Libellus de Exodio, includes a posthumous miracle about Cuthbert, our famous Cuthbert. In this story, Bishop Eardulf and Abbot Eadred set out with Cuthbert's body for Ireland. Now, as they leave the River Derwent, tentatively identified here on the map, to cross the Irish Sea, an intense storm surrounds them, with waves that turn to blood. Of course, once again echoing the narratives of Egypt and the Red Sea crossing from the Bible. During the storm, a gold and gem-adorned book, cautiously identified as the Lindisfarne Gospels, is lost to sea. So there's straight away the winds change, there's towering waves, it becomes very stormy, and in the course of this storm, the boat turns to its side, and a gospel book ornamented with gold and gems falls from the boat and is carried to the depths of the sea in Maris Ferebato Profunda. It should be noted that this section was taken largely from the earliest part of the De Miraculis et Translationibus Sancti Cuthberti, which is a collection of 21 stories in total concerning miracles associated with Cuthbert, appended often to manuscripts of Bede's prose Life of St. Cuthbert. In the next chapter, however, of Simeon's Libellus, he includes a new miracle utilizing the tidal revelation motif. So before settling at Durham, the cult of St. Cuthbert traveled with his body, hiding from Danish raiders, until at one point a handful of them are charged with protecting the saint's relics. They pray for aid in this task and are granted a miracle. Cuthbert appears in a vision to one of the men named Hunred, which you can see on the slide. And he orders them that when the tide goes out, they should look for the book, which, as was said above, had fallen out of the ship into the midst of the waves. And perhaps contrary to anything they might hope, they would by God's mercy find it. Soon he went to several of his comrades and said, let's go take a look at this place, go and find this. And they come to a place called the White Horse, or by the common people, Whithorn. The vision tells also of Hunred to find a bridle hanging from a tree, which a horse will come to, and there'll be a cart so they can carry Cuthbert's heavy body. And here we have this section. So they came to the sea and saw it had receded much further than normal. When they had walked 3 miles or more, they found the same holy book of the Gospels, which retained its enrichment of gems and gold on the outside, as on the inside it showed the former beauty of its letters, axi ib aqua minime tactus fuisit, as if it had not been touched by the water at all. Unlike the miracle of St. Clement in the tideless Black Sea, here we have a specific location on the west side of Britain, with its extraordinary tidal variation. The miracle works by virtue, in a sense, of local and situational knowledge, that the tide in this part of Britain did not usually recede 3 miles from the shore. While the specific number of miles, 3, points to influence from texts, at least the tradition of things like the Passio, I haven't found any direct evidence of borrowing here. But either way, the point of the miracle is that the tide here does not actually go that far usually, so it's miraculous in its extent. And just for fun, here is where 3 miles would take us from Woodhorn, curiously coming quite close to the potential path I showed earlier of the on which the Gospel book is originally lost. I'm not suggesting this is true. I'm just saying it works in terms of its story potential. While Simeon expectedly attributes the miracle to Cuthbert and the makers of the Gospels itself, so Bishop Eadfrith, who wrote it, Athelwald, who ordered the gold covering, St. Bilfrith, it is the tide that, via the implied power of God through St. Cuthbert, breaks the physical space in which some miraculous, in which some miraculous could be encountered. It allows people to enter into a location beyond human control, a kind of aqueous otherworld, a holy kind of otherworld, akin to those in the Irish sources. Likewise, the material qualities of water, which normally destroy parchment and rust different kinds of metal, have not affected the book at all. Together, this miracle becomes part of the cult of Cuthbert in that the Lindisfarne Gospels, according to Simeon, are preserved in the church alongside Cuthbert's body, and that there is no sign of the book being harmed by water. These intertidal worlds, whether the single chapel of St. Clement, the more expansive set of buildings in the Irish sources, or the location of the gilded Gospels, all rely on the material qualities of tides and water to allow or deny access, with the access understood as only being granted through the power of God, whether directly or indirectly. Right, now to the potentially more mundane, or at least tastier portion of our journey tonight, resources and food. The intertidal zones of these islands, not to mention the sea itself, provided resources, as I mentioned earlier. For example, David Petts highlights the breadth of resource extraction in his study of intertidal locations in Northumbria. This includes seals, which still use the tidal sandbanks at Lindisfarne as haulouts when the tide is out, seaweed, potentially used as fertilizer, fish caught with tidal fish traps and weirs. As you can see here, I really like this one. It's in Wales, but it's quite an interesting one. And a range of intertidal shellfish on the Northumbrian shores, including periwinkle, whelk, this is where I theoretically get the purple dye from, oysters, which are very tasty, dog whelk, also tasty, limpets, common mussel, and cockles. Now, as David Petts further points out, however, tidal patterns as lunar phenomena are extraordinarily complex, with the time of high and low tides changing each day by around 50 minutes. The 2-week cycle with the interrelationship between the lunar and solar cycle, resulting in spring, that's maximum, and neap, minimum tides, and the proximity of the moon to the Earth. At its closest, its perigee, and its furthest, its apogee, as well as local variables like wind direction, air pressure, and the geology around it as well. Now, such changes altered which kinds of resources could be accessed. This means that for people to gather intertidal resources, their daily schedules would have to shift around the ever-shifting tides. For example, the timing of the tides was gathering periwinkle from the higher and middle intertidal zone at most times except high tide, and oysters in the lower and sublittoral section at low tide. Now, to examine more specifically the the ways in which the material realities of the sea, its tidal actions, and shifting transparency affected the lives of early medieval English peoples and their literature. Today, we're going to focus on oysters. As numerous recent studies have demonstrated, oysters were a common food item. And as Todd Preston argues, they essentially surpassed most other food sources. in this period in terms of things from the sea. And as Megan Cavell and other scholars have noted, oysters are included in the list of food items caught by the fishermen in Alfred's colloquy on the occupations, and form the part of the common diet of many monastic houses, as evidenced, among other things, by the fact that monastic sign language includes a sign just for oysters. For example, the Old English version of the Monasterialis Indicia has only 3 signs for sea creatures, 1 for fish, all of them, 1 for eels, because eels are tasty, and 1 exclusively for oysters. So it says here, if you want an oyster, and you close your left hand, and if you as if you had an oyster in it, and then you make a knife with your fingers, I'm not sure how many fingers, maybe 2 or 3, I don't know, and you sort of pretend like you're digging at it. In the early medieval period, there is little evidence for the cultivation of oysters, and the locations where there is evidence of consumption are almost entirely on or near the coast. Now, oysters could be pickled, and were, and could theoretically survive transportation fresh for about a week if packed well, and if you were really, brave in eating them once it got there. It was not really until the mid-11th century that cultivation of oysters allowed them to be eaten more widely. So oysters then were a common important food source, widely known and consumed, particularly in the earlier period by individual collection from intertidal zones. Yet it was the material reality of the intertidal zones that both barred and allowed access to these resources, the sea covering, revealing, that shaped the daily lives of those seeking to extract them. So how does this all relate to literature, you might ask, because I've been going on for a while now, about 20 minutes of this. To answer that, there is perhaps nowhere better to look than the Old English riddles of the Exeter books, specifically riddle 74. And just to note that I'm using Orchard's new Dumbarton Oaks edition, in which it's labeled 74. Depending on how you break up riddle 1, it's either riddle 74 or riddle, I think, 77 in other editions. Now, while the ending of this riddle is quite literally burned out of existence, scholars have almost universally agreed that the riddle object is an oyster, likely something like the Ostrea edulis European flat oyster, with a notable exception of an article by Todd Preston, who argues for a possible misdirect, and the answer is flatfish, which is also quite interesting. The riddle has nonetheless received considerable attention, most decidedly anthropocentric in focus. Several more recent engagements with the text shift to the oyster itself, including Currendell's discussion of the violence being enacted upon the oyster and the condemnatory nature of the human eating, to Harriet Soper's 2023 book, The Life Course in Old English Poetry, in which she convincingly argues for a nuanced and, quote, isomorphic reading, potentially related to age-specific experiences. Now, today, I'd like to suggest an alternative, let's say, saltier, more aqueous vision, that the material agentic actions of the sea are both focus and environment for every line of the poem. That it's the sea water's actions that ultimately determine the actions of everything else in the poem. And here it is, and we'll read it quickly. Se mech feda sun helm theate, an mech ida rugan erothan yatenge, feda lese. Oft ich flode ongean muth ontunde. Nu, wille mon som min flesh fretan, fedas ne rechat, sidan heme av sidan seaxes ode, heid arupeth, on met frade sitan, itet on sodem. And an edge, and then it peters off. Now, the first half of the fragmentary poem overtly describes the sea's actions in a phrase fairly unique. And just to note that, like many of you, this paper has been slightly hampered by the DOE corpus being offline at the moment. So I haven't been able to, for example, figure out how many other instances of a se plus things like fed on exist. But if any of you know of any uses, please let me know afterwards. Anyway, so se mech fede, the sea feeds or nourishes me. The sea is depicted as bringing sustenance with the verb fedan, whose semantic range includes physical, spiritual, and sometimes even kind of psychological nourishment. Here are some examples from Maxims 1, Genesis A, and Riddle 51. So for example, in Maxims we have mean mon shall mid metum fedan, one must nourish strength with food. Or in the wonderful one from Riddle 51, Wudu Wexenda. There we go. Now I can see them. That tree was unwine Wudu Wexenda, waterhine on otha fed and fere. That tree was joyful, wood growing, water and soil nourished it beautifully. Sorry, I'm just going to move the video around so I can see the text. There we go. Right. So next, the sea provides shelter. There we go. Protection, sun helm theachte, the sea helm cover, the sea helmet covered. The language here is telling, I think. The noun sun has a variety of aqueous meanings, including ocean, sea, wave, but in the majority of instances, the waters being denoted are either themselves moving or, very few times, having something move through them. It's a noun of water, in and of motion. For example, we have in Maxims and Beowulf up on the screen. Summerswaya hat soon on stille, the ocean is restless. Or in Beowulf, we have Stremas wundan soon with sande, the currents eddied, the sea against the sand. Or later in the poem, Selice se drakan soon the kunian, the strange sea creatures testing the currents. This word is then combined with helm, a noun meaning primarily a covering or helmet, often with a sense of protection. And then the compound noun sunhelm acts to thechan, to cover or protect. Now, thechan itself is used, for example, in riddle 1, with reference to the clothes the kinswoman wraps the riddle object in, contextually implying a protecting function, kind of loving and nourishing action, as you can see. Oh, sorry. No, there we are. That's riddle 7. There we go. Yes. We have Thamech ongan wel hode me wedum thechan heodon freothode chleo seorparach, etc. So, but then a certain one, kinsman woman most constant, to cover me with clothes, retained and maintain me, wrapped me in robes. Right. There we go. The compound noun sunhelm itself occurs only twice in the the oyster riddle, and once in riddle 1 to describe the sea surface under which the riddle object is covered until God lets it loose, as you can see here. We have sunhelm ne me losian ermet latte sethin min latio bith on sida yahwam. My sea helm I cannot lose before he lets me, who is my leader on every expedition. This action is then doubled by line 2 in our riddle, onmesh ida rugan yatenge, and the waves concealed me close to the ground. The nature of this concealment is twofold, particularly when compared with a strikingly similar collocation again from riddle 1. And there's a comparison on the screen between riddle 74 and riddle 1. So in riddle 1, we get ida yathware themich rugan, whereas in riddle 74, we get on mech ida rugan erothan yatenge. So you can see we have mech ida and rugan sharing a similar collocation between the poems. Now, in the context of riddle 1, the ocean is being depicted at storm, with the sea growling, howling, and waves that foam and crash. That is what covers the riddle object in riddle 1. Then when the sea calms, the riddle object is able to be drawn out. That is when the sea surface is still, and by implication, transparent. So we have Seathon Goman Hua Mich Bragde of Primus Fadmum, Don Estremas Eft Stile Weorthath, Ida Yathware Themich out of Rugan. Say who draws me from the waves' embrace when the streams again grow still, the breakers calm that concealed me before. I would argue that a similar meaning is intended in riddle 74, that the waves conceal the riddle object both physically, as in they prevent access to the hand, but also visually, as in they prevent access to the eye. The either in both riddles protect and conceal. Next, we come to a set of mutual actions by both the sea and the riddle object, the oyster. Othflode ongern muth ontunde, often in the face of the flood I opened my mouth. Now, much ink has been given to this apparently passive behavior by the oyster. I would like to argue that it's a little bit less passive than it appears. The first action, given the context and the uses of Old English flowed, is inherent in the noun's use. It's the tide, a slippery context which exists only as action, as the motion of sea in and out. The entire aqueous environment described above is now moving. In response to the action, oft, that is, I would say, during each tide, the riddle object responds by opening its mouth towards or against the tide. The preposition ongean here is often used in a kind of adversarial manner, against something, against or towards something, as in riddle 25, where it appears, sonethat on finda sethe mich faith ongean, and on with mayan theis on mindre yanaste. Straightway he perceives who struggles against me and strives against my mighty force. Yet it can also be more positive, a description of one thing moving actively towards another or facing something else, as in the phoenix describing the creature headed towards God. Or as here, sorry, in metrical psalms in which virtues move towards God. Him gangath ongen gleva kraftas, discerning virtues advanced to meet him. The use of ongen indicates then not complete passivity or necessarily antagonism, but an active response to something. The sea nourishes, covers, conceals, and then moves forward and back, during which the oyster, in a kind of proto-scientific observation of its filter feeding, actively opens and by implication eats, receives the nourishment offered. Then we come to the chronological axis upon which the fate of the rill turns. Nu, now, enter a human. But when is the poetic now? Given the remaining lines include the implied extraction of the oyster from a previously protected location, I would argue that it is the tide moving out to sea, drawing away the Soonhelm until the oyster is revealed. It's the sea's tidal actions here that allow the person to engage in their, as we will see, likely condemnatory consumption of the riddle object. Nu willa monsoon men flash fretan. Starting with Mercedes Salvador Bello and continuing with Currendale, Heidi Estes, and Carl Steele, among others, attention has been drawn to the lexical importance of the verbs of consumption here, with fretan, as loosely summarized by Soper, quote, associated with animalistic, voracious, and monstrous, devouring, contrasting with the verb etan, which covers a more general sense of eating. Taken together with the violence of the following lines, including Phi bis felas ne rechat, doesn't care for my skin, and the action of using a sharp sex to plunder the hide, including the word unsodne, uncooked, the depiction of the human here does seem to be condemnatory. These are not praiseworthy actions. But who are we meant to imagine this unnamed person to be? Cavell and others have drawn comparisons to regulations, particularly as expressed in text, like the Old English poem Seasons for Fasting, which describes how fasting priests indulged in wine and oysters because they weren't prohibited on fasting days. So they sing their masses in the morning, and they're really thirsty. I love this. They roam the streets looking for the tavern keeper, and then Hoati leas liche leogon on ginath on thone tapera taitet yolome seja that he sinless silemote osranto ete an ateles win. They often lying and urge him that it's okay. You aren't going to sin if you give us oysters and excellent wine to eat. So this could be a moralizing depiction of a sinning priest. And given the Benedictine context in which riddles were likely penned, this is generally a convincing conclusion. There is, however, a shift I would like to suggest here, one that focuses less on the comparison between a sinning human eating an uncooked oyster and the implied holy human who does not do these actions, and instead on the parallel comparison within the poem between the oyster and the human, the two actants whose behavior is ultimately shaped by the sea. Whether this is a priest or in every person a true monosume, the poem, as it survives and is often printed, has two distinct sections joined by this temporal nu. Now, let's go back to the oyster. What does it do? Right? It cannot move. It's featherless, here likely meaning simply lacking the ability to walk or move about, to make any motion. But, as suggested earlier, it actively opens itself to the tide, by implication to feed to gain the nourishment of line 1. The verb chosen to mark this action is ontunan. Now, the weak verb semantic ground covers a generalized sense of to open, but also often to reveal. And in many, perhaps a majority of uses, again, I can say more once the Diego Corpus comes back online, focuses on heaven being open or being revealed. So in Christ's Day, for example, it's used when asking Christ to command the golden gates of heaven to be opened. And similarly here in Solomon and Saturn, it's used when Saturn asks who can open the holy doors, the halgandura tochte on tunan. As far as I found thus far, the verb on tunan is most often a kind of positive opening, letting something in or revealing something like heaven. When used in the poetic context of opening mouths to receive nourishment, it appears once in the metrical psalms in AD 10 through 11, in which God was reminding people of how he led them out of Egypt, a kind of harken back to the manna from heaven, and they should they should open wide their mouths and he will fill them. It also, I should say though, is in one of three negative uses I have found, appears in the Old English poem The Whale twice to describe the opening of the whale's jaw to entice fish in, and the subsequent and linked opening of the doors of hell. That's Muth on Tunath in line 53b and Hela on Tunath in 68b. But given the overall positive nature of the sea and the oyster in our poem, and the more general positive uses of Ontunan, the oyster's actions are, I think, likely more positive, like they are in the Paris Psalter. So the oyster's action, as discussed earlier, a response to the sea's tidal motion, the God-ordained moment that conceals and reveals, allowing the oyster to receive nourishment. Again, think back to riddle 1. There is a patience here, a humble waiting for the food granted in God's good time. The oyster does not seek, rip, uncaringly kill. It waits, as if in prayer, opening to receive nourishment. And here the lexical range of fed on comes in, pointing to any kind of nourishment. There's a lot you could do with this, physical, spiritual. This contrasts directly with the person. They come, plunder, because they want to fretan, to devour like a beast, something unable to eat in line with the rules of God and humanity. Someone unable to restrain the body in pursuit of purity, and instead just to devour. And while the poem is unfinished, there does seem to be a contrastive parallelism, I'd say, between lines 4a and 8a, with Muth ontunde and Iteth onsodene. I open my mouth to receive nourishment, or I eat uncooked. The oyster opens itself to receive from the sea. The human consumes swiftly, not even bothering to cook, a furtive, secret, illicit kind of consumption. In lines 1 to 4a, we have the created world living essentially as God intended, potentially Edenic, in which the sea covers, protects, nourishes the oyster, and the oyster opens itself to these gifts. In lines 4b to 8b, we have the human as beast, as fallen from grace, unwilling to care for the world or the God who made it. This is all a bit wild, I'll agree, tentative, but I do think interesting. That riddle 74 could be considered to be structured by functioning through and focusing on the sea, specifically through two of its material qualities, the transparency or opacity of water and its tidal actions. This connects back to the tidal miracles we looked at earlier in the talk. In the end, I'm suggesting that by focusing on the sea, on its specific material qualities, its actions upon early medieval English peoples, animals, and the world as a whole, its potency and influence will become apparent. Now, a few notes about the future that Suzuki mentioned. This research represents my very first, very tentative strokes in my new 5-year research project called Knowing Oceans, the early medieval English North Sea, funded by the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. The project aims to investigate human interaction with the North Sea in the British archipelago in the medieval period. I'm kind of cutting it off at 1200 just to, give me somewhere to cut it off, and reveal how such interactions were conceptualized and utilized primarily in literary productions. To achieve this goal, the project will bring together approaches from many fields, including literary studies, linguistics, archaeology, medieval studies, eco-criticism, environmental history, and historical climatology. To engage with all this data, I'm going to be using digital humanities tools like GIS databases and mapping. And I'm going to be traveling along the North Sea coast whenever I can for the next 5 years. And I would very much appreciate any thoughts, suggestions, locations, especially ideas for collaborations, definitely any critiques that any of you may have in pursuing this goal. Thank you very much for your time. I hope that was at least marginally interesting, and I look forward to your questions.